Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all. It's Bear here. And I'd like to welcome you to my YouTube channel, aboxwithnolid. A channel I'm creating to not only just to bring awareness to the day-to-day lived realities trauma creates, but to get into the understandings necessary to build a better foundation, to delve into ways and explore ways of healing and to improve the quality of our lives. Now, this is the next video in the adoption series. So again, adoptees, please be mindful. What I want to start to look at, and these are the areas of adoption that get really, really hard to explain because of how individual they are. But due to our attachments being a threat response, the fog, and due to the impossible choices we've had to make to survive and work with this fog and to attach to non-biological families and to try to make all this stuff work, to try to make sense of an impossible amount of chaos and emotional upheaval, to try to make sense of things by ourselves because any questions we ask is a threat to our adopted relationship. So we can't ask them. And that's for future videos. But this one I want to get into the beginnings of exploring the attachment aspect and this overwhelming need for physical connection, for being part of something, and this absolute despising of it. It's this battle that I see play out in so many variations, but I'm yet to meet an adoptee who doesn't have this running in the background. And every way it plays out is individual to varying intensities. And it also comes down to the childhood the adoptee has. It comes down to the expectations of the adopted parents, the environment you grew up in. There's all these, this is why it is so individualistic. But it is all still there. And the reason it needs to be looked at even in functional adoptee relationships is adoption family relationships is at some point the question of a reunion with biological family may be thrown into the mix. And quite often it can be involuntary, especially now with these, transitioning to digital forms of identification, or if you get a physical, a medical related illness and you need family medical history. There's numerous out of your control things that can occur that will force you to find a way of interacting with or trying to initiate the search, from the negotiations with your adopted family to being able to do it and keeping it secret, which is what most of us do, and how you're going to navigate this impossible mess comes down to and creates this real issue that we need to be aware of keeping into the balance aspect of our attachment. This need to physically connect comes from that infant need in the box to be picked up and held by our mother and father and welcomed into our biological family. That being unrequited for whatever length of time. And time does play a part in it, but time is not a factor of scale, because the reason I say this is there are some instances where an adoptee is basically taken from their biological mother and within an hour placed in the arms of an adoptive parent, thinking that it will instantly connect and attach, which I've not seen it alter what we deal with in an observed sense. It's this thing of that driving force, of that need, of needing to be picked up and held and everything being made right by safely being and securely being part of a biological family, by all these mechanisms that we are designed to have, drives this need to connect. And for the most of us, that is a terrifying concept, because when we're younger, when we're little and we try to explore these things, most of us get misunderstood, get in trouble, or it goes south. You know, this is where for adoptees crushes, childhood crushes are far more critical in our development than people understand. Is it's those first explorations of how are we going to work with this desire to connect? How are we going to put it into balance? Because it's never had anything to connect to. Remember, when we attach to adoptive family, we cannot steer it there because of the obstacle of the initial stages. If it is a survival script, we need to function. There's this whole obstacle that if you can work through it, awesome. But in the majority of adoptions, it doesn't get worked through. It doesn't even get acknowledged, and most people aren't aware of it. So there's this obstacle, so that cannot be played out. Sometimes with siblings within adoption families, it can play out a little bit there. But there's this overwhelming need to connect, and no outlet in our developmental years and our learning years to where we can make mistakes without disastrous interactions. And because of that lack of understanding, when we get a little older in our adolescence, we get the humiliation of it not going the way it needs to, which makes a lot of us withdraw and adds another layer of obstacle and harm and rejection. And it feeds into our mom never coming into that room and picking us up out of that box. It feeds into all of these things, which again make attachments, particularly in romantic relationships, a freaking minefield for adoptees. Because what the world doesn't understand is what our body is trying to make sense of. This impossible amount of chaos never leaves us. We may repress it and bury it in all the ways that we do, but it is always there. This is why, for want of a better analogy, we have this overwhelming need to connect, and we despise that need. And that plays out in various degrees of detachment in our friendships and relationships and our coping mechanisms and all the structures we put in place to try to make sense of it and function. To not be made a fool of, or to not get so devastatingly hurt when asking someone to meet up for a cup of coffee and they reject us and they humiliate us in that rejection. Of not knowing what to do and how to approach interactions, and all these layers of stuff that I see and observed in so many interactions and observing adoptees at conferences, at meetings and gatherings and so forth. But also when you listen to people's stories and all the online forums and talking with other adoptees and having this awareness, I see all this stuff play out all the time. And there's a reason why there are all these structures. And that reason is we are always trying to make sense of an impossible amount of chaos and never being supported in making sense of it, because of the protections of the statement of adoption is a good thing and it's a forever family. It fixes everything. Because the world doesn't want to go there and question a practice that is centuries old and has centuries of harm, is why this is so hard and why so often adoptees we become by ourselves. We function better by ourselves. We don't want to be. But we don't know how to do it any other way. Or we live such isolated relationships within our relationships. And the understanding just comes down to, as I've said numerous times, is we are trying to make sense of an impossible amount of chaos. And we cannot go to that chaos because we have no tools or resources to work with it. Now, as these videos progress, I want to start to touch on ways to be able to work with that chaos. But the obstacle we have is because of the lack of understanding in the world. And no matter how many years I've fought to try to get that understanding, people in the system and healthcare systems and government don't want to freaking go there. Without that understanding, it makes it almost impossible to work through. Hence, like I said in previous videos, the price tag when the fog collapses. So, for all of you out there that are with or around adoptees, understand that our fumblings and failings, our detachments, and our over-the-top responses are just our attempt to try to make sense of an impossible amount of chaos. And for all my fellow adoptees out there, it's the same. I validate you, I validate myself in our attempts and our glorious attempts at trying to make sense of this chaos and all the creative ways we have come up with to try to function. But we also need to acknowledge that at some point that impossible amount of chaos needs to be understood and looked at, because at some point it's going to break through all our chains and everything we put onto that box, and it's going to find its way into our lives. So as always, I love your guys' feedback. Please be mindful. Please be safe. Please be respectful. And I'll see you next time. Hope.